Please subscribe to hear more Cryptid Tales. If you like the story you heard, give us a thumbs up and feel free to leave us a comment. If you'd like to hear your own cryptid encounter on Cryptid Tales, send us an email at cryptidtalesmail@gmail.com. Back in the 1980s and early 90s, I was a scoutmaster for my son's Boy Scout troop, along with another gentleman who also had a son in the same troop. The boys in the group had been begging us to go on a primitive camping trip instead of the usual campouts we had done before within campgrounds or in bunkhouses at Boy Scout camps. They wanted to use some of the skills they had been learning, so we decided we would give it a shot. Nothing too serious or too rugged, but far enough into the wilderness that they would feel like they were really roughing it. The other scoutmaster knew of a place where he and a buddy of his had done some deer hunting a few years prior. During his hunting trip, he had found an open access to a place called Horse Thief Canyon. The canyon had a natural spring-fed creek that ran through the middle of it, surrounded by thick timber. At the mouth of the canyon, the land rose into a small open hill with trees skirting the outer edges. All of this was nestled inside a forest of old hardwoods and cedars. It was completely isolated, but still only a couple miles from the gravel road. It sounded perfect. A few weeks later, and we found ourselves parked at a turnaround at the end of a gravel road. There was an opening in the tree line with a worn-down footpath that hunters used to access the area. Next to the trailhead was an old, rusted-up metal sign on a post that was riddled with holes from people using it as target practice over the years. You couldn't even read the sign anymore, as much due to the bullet holes as the rust. We had planned the trip to take place in between hunting seasons, and after seeing the sign, I was glad we did. Even if Chuck, the other scoutmaster, was confident that no one hunted out there anymore. After stretching our legs a bit, we grabbed our packs, got the boys settled down, and headed into the woods. In total, there were 8 of us on the trip, which was a good thing. The boys could all buddy up in pairs on the hike, and the less people, the easier going it was for us. The bright opening to the trail disappeared behind us in no time, and soon the sounds of civilization were nothing more than a distant whisper. The trail itself ended up vanishing not too far into the woods, and we soon found ourselves blazing our own path. We stopped periodically to rest a few minutes and let Chuck remember which direction we were going. Like he said, he hadn't been out there in a couple of years, but even so, he never got us lost. In the late afternoon, the woods started opening up a bit, and we found ourselves on the hill, just like Chuck had said. We assigned tasks for the boys and set up camp on top of the hill. The spot really was perfect for camping, but the best thing about it was the canyon. You couldn't even see or realize the canyon was there until you were on top of the hill. It was like the woods were hiding it and keeping it a secret. No wonder it was called Horse Thief Canyon. Nobody would ever find you there. I envisioned bandits leading a train of stolen horses into the mouth of the canyon and disappearing into the trees. The next morning, we were up bright and early. We were going to explore the canyon, and everyone was excited about it, including myself. We made our way down the hill and followed the creek Chuck had spoken of into the mouth of the canyon. Once inside, the trees seemed to swallow us up. Their tall trunks reached up for the daylight above the canyon, and their limbs created almost a dome above us. It was amazing how isolated it felt inside those canyon walls. I asked Chuck how far back the canyon went, but he said he didn't know, and that he had never been this far into it. To be honest, I'm not sure anyone had been that far into the canyon. At least not since some horse thieves used it to escape the gallows. There weren't any signs of people in there. No old campsites, no remnants of an old campfire. I didn't even see any trash. Matter of fact, we hadn't even seen any signs of wildlife other than a few deer tracks at the canyon mouth, and an occasional squirrel barking at us as we hiked by. The walls of the canyon started getting closer, and the trees gave way to open air. Off to one side were some large boulders sitting in a pool of cold, clear water. We had found the spring that fed the creek, and the boys rushed over and filled their canteens. We all sat down around the pool and ate our lunch before heading back out of the canyon. In what seemed no time at all, we were back at our hilltop camp. The boys preoccupied themselves by making some primitive shelters out of tree limbs and looking for edible plants. But it wasn't long until they came to us asking if we could move camp into the canyon. Chuck and I talked it over and decided it would be all right. The boys cheered and quickly tore down camp. Within minutes, we were all packed up and headed back into the canyon. Destination, the spring. By the time we reached the spring, the sun had dipped below the top of the canyon, but there was still plenty of daylight left to see what we were doing. We set up our tents across from the spring and built us a nice fire. Soon we were enjoying cans of beanie weenies and watching embers dance above the fire. Things were winding down and it was about time for everyone to turn in for the night. In fact, 3 of the boys already had, along with Chuck. I sent the other boys to their tent for the night and stoked the fire a bit. As I sat there staring into the fire, the sensation that I was being watched creeped over me. Goosebumps ran up my arms and I shuddered. I peered off towards the woods, but the fire between myself and the trees prevented me from seeing anything more than shadows. It was probably nothing, a deer maybe, or a coyote. I instinctively yanked my head towards the sound of a stick snapping from just beyond the tree line. Why was I so spooked? The woods make noises at night, I knew that. So I convinced myself it was nothing and crawled into the tent. I found myself suddenly awake, peering up at the tent ceiling. Something had woken me, but I didn't know what. I looked over at Chuck on the other side of the tent, but he was still sound asleep. The fire outside popped, but was no longer producing any flame. I thought to myself that maybe one of the boys had got up to answer the call of nature and it woke me up. I strained my ears to listen for an answer. That's when I heard the sound of a light splashing coming from the spring pool. Then it stopped. I sat up, trying to listen harder. Something exhaled a large breath of air just in front of the tent. My heart skipped a beat. I had never heard of any bears in this area. Surely it wasn't a bear. What happened next, I have a hard time putting into words. Not what I witnessed, but the emotions I felt as it happened. Words like scared or terrified just don't do it justice. I sat there frozen, watching in a state of petrified disbelief, as a gigantic hand attached to a huge, muscular arm slowly reached into the tent from the other side of the tent flaps. These monstrous fingers with these thick, almost black fingernails felt around at the end of my sleeping bag. If I hadn't been sitting up, my feet would have been right there. I felt dizzy at the thought of it grabbing my foot and dragging me out of the tent. In my fright, I had stopped breathing. My instincts kicked in and I sucked in a breath of air against my own will. The hair-covered arm yanked the hand out of the tent at the sound of my gasping. I sat there for a moment, expecting some gigantic creature to come ripping through the tent, but nothing happened. A cold sweat came over me as my mind raced, trying to comprehend what I had just experienced. This creature was out there. Was there more than just one? The boys, we have to protect the boys. What if it goes after them? The only thing I could think to do was wake Chuck, but would he even believe me? I had to take my chances. After I got Chuck awake, I got a lantern lit and told him what had happened to the best of my ability. At first he questioned it. It was probably just a dream, or maybe the boys playing a prank. At that moment, a long ascending howl echoed through the canyon. Not a howl you would hear a coyote or a wolf make. This sounded like a human. Only there was no way a human could howl that long or that loudly. Chuck and I put our boots on and headed outside the tent. Relief ran over me as I exited the tent and saw that there was no monster waiting on me on the other side of the flaps. I held the lantern up towards the boys' tents. Everything seemed okay. Chuck threw some limbs on the fire and lit up the camp. I held the lantern up high and peered down the back of the canyon behind our tents. For a moment, I thought I had seen something, but when I raised the light, it was gone. I asked Chuck what he thought we should do. I was answered with silence. I said his name again, but still nothing. I turned back around to see Chuck's back facing me. From the tilt of his head, I could see he was looking up towards the top of the canyon wall. As I looked up, I felt my heart drop to my feet and then spring back up into my throat. There, at the top of the canyon, was an enormous silhouette of a creature. You could see the tips of the long hair that was covering its body gently swaying in the breeze. It was clearly standing on two legs, but was only visible from the thighs up because of the angle. It stood there, motionless, staring back down at us. The shoulders were wider than the rest of the body, and the head that looked almost too small for its body sat hunkered down between them. I quickly spun around at the sound of a rock falling against the canyon wall on the opposite side. Almost directly above the spring was another one, this one a little bit smaller and leaner than the other, but still larger than a man by any means. Then, another slightly larger than the second one walked up into sight next to it. How many were out there? Chuck's voice broke the silence, but barely. I couldn't make out everything he said, but the part I did hear was, "Get the boys, we're leaving." Chuck never took his eyes off the large one. I got the boys awake, and as quietly and calmly as I could, told them to get their clothes on and grab whatever flashlights they had. They, of course, immediately started asking questions, but I didn't answer them. I just told them to hurry. Chuck was standing with his back to the fire by the time I got the boys up and out of their tents. He never looked up at the creatures, and almost as if he could read my mind, he shook his head no at me as I joined him at the fire with the boys. He didn't have to say anything. I understood. We grouped up with the boys between us, turned on all of our lights, and hiked out of the canyon in the middle of the night. We didn't gather up camp. We didn't put out the fire. We didn't even let the boys grab their packs. We abandoned everything and got out of there as quickly as the dark of the night would allow us to. When we got to the mouth of the canyon, we could hear limbs snapping and breaking behind us. The boys kept trying to turn around and look, but we just kept pushing them to keep moving. You could tell their fear was growing by the noises they were hearing, and their scoutmaster's strange behavior, but so was ours. We walked through our old campsite and crested the top of the hill. You could hear whistles back and forth answering one another from all around us. As we hiked through the thick hardwoods back towards the road, you could hear them walking just beyond our sight on both sides of us, pacing us as we went. It was like they were herding us out of the woods, but they didn't need to. We were leaving on our own. Up ahead, I could see the opening in the tree line and the outline of that old shot-up sign. We had made it. We got the boys loaded up in the Suburban. Chuck walked around to the driver's side door, and I waited for him to unlock my door so I could retreat to the safety of the vehicle. I shined a flashlight back down the trail into the woods one last time to make sure nothing was coming after me. There, about 25 yards in, next to a big elm tree, were these two giant red eyes looking back at me. Then, from the other side of the trail, another set of eyes. Then another, and another. The door lock clicked behind me, and without hesitation I jumped in, relocking the door as I got in. We took off down the road, spitting out gravel behind us. My son asked from the seat behind me why we had left like we did, leaving all of our stuff. Before I could think of a response, Chuck said, "Bears. We saw some bears." The rest of the car ride home was quiet. We never went back for our stuff. Chuck pulled his son out of the Scouts a week later, and I decided to do the same. We never talked about what we saw or what happened. After that, we didn't even keep in touch. But even though we never talked about it or acknowledged it, we both know what those creatures were, and they weren't bears.